In this lecture, we will be examining the causes of and the major events leading up to the American Civil War. This war resulted in over 1 million casualties, and approximately 3% of Americans were killed or wounded in the conflict. The Civil War resulted in approximately as many American deaths as all American deaths in other U.S. wars combined. Something between 625,000 and 800,000 Union and Confederate soldiers died in the conflict. In some ways, slavery is the most obvious of the causes of the Civil War, but it is also the least understood of causes. Dating back to the era of the Constitution, the slavery issue was a divisive problem that did not get resolved until the Union and Confederacy went to war. Slavery contributed to widening the differences between North and South. However, the North did not directly go to war with the states in rebellion over slavery. Lincoln's stated objective was to keep the Union together. Abolitionism was growing in influence, but many Northerners would have continued to tolerate Southern slavery if it meant that the Union would have stayed intact. The 1820 Missouri Compromise was an agreement between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in Congress. The compromise outlawed slavery in the former Louisiana Territory, excepting Missouri. It set the precedent for admitting a slave state when a free state would also be admitted, such as Arkansas in 1836 and Michigan in 1837. However, the Compromise of 1820 simply put off until a future date the issue of slavery, and the compromise thus helped worsen the growing sectional divide in the United States. In general terms, sectionalism can be defined as having greater loyalty to the interests of one's own section of the country as opposed to the nation as a whole. Slavery helped worsen the growing sense that the southern states, and to a lesser extent the northern states, were beginning to place more emphasis on the good of their own region than that of the United States. Congressional voting records in the decades before the Civil War show clear evidence of the sectional divide as represented by legislative votes on major issues. Somewhat related to the issue of sectionalism is the quarrel over states' rights. Dating back to the 1832 nullification crisis, there was a sentiment among many in the South that Southern states could ignore laws they considered unjust, or that they could even leave the Union. A few 21st century observers maintain that the issue of states' rights was the principal cause of the Civil War, but most historians argue that the only right Southern states consistently tried to defend was the right to permit slavery. The issue of states' rights is also sometimes used to obscure or diminish the prominence of slavery in analyses of the causes of the Civil War. As evidence of the relative lack of importance of the issue of states' rights, one need only look at the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. This Confederate Constitution was virtually identical to the U.S. Constitution, and the few significant differences that can be found in the Confederate Constitution relate to the issue of slavery. In some ways, it's a word-for-word rewriting of the Constitution. As discussed in an earlier lecture, the Compromise of 1850 was a collection of 5 separate bills. Under the package of laws, California was admitted as a free state. The sale of slaves was abolished in the District of Columbia, although slave ownership itself was not banned at that time. A much stricter Fugitive Slave Act passed Congress. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized under the concept of popular sovereignty, whereby citizens would decide for themselves whether or not to permit slavery. And finally, as part of the Compromise of 1850, Texas gave up many of the western lands for which it had claims, and it received compensation to pay off its debt. This compromise worsened pre-existing sectional problems and, unfortunately, only temporarily delayed the coming crisis. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was a best-selling book that sold over 1 million copies after being published. Many people who were previously undecided or ambivalent about slavery now embraced abolitionism. The book angered many Southerners who viewed Uncle Tom's Cabin as an attack on the Southern way of life. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created two new territories in Kansas and Nebraska. The act opened vast new lands for white settlement. Essentially, the act gutted the Missouri Compromise of 1820 because it allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to determine through the means of popular sovereignty whether slavery would be permitted in each territory. There was something of a mad dash to fill each state with residents for each side of the debate, pro-slavery and abolition activists. The term Bleeding Kansas emerged due to the fact that slavery and abolitionist partisans quickly turned to violence to further their political causes. Approximately 100 people died in this political violence, while many hundreds of others were injured and countless homes destroyed. Eventually, Kansas joined the Union, though for some time there were two competing state governments in Kansas, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. In a way, this period served as a sort of premonition of the Civil War, as the concept of popular sovereignty proved to be a failure with regard to slavery. In the Dred Scott versus Sandford case, Dred Scott was a slave who was taken by his owner into the free states, or free territories rather, of Wisconsin and Illinois. Scott then sued for freedom after the death of his owner, basing his claim on the Missouri Compromise, because above the Missouri line were to be free states and free territories. The Supreme Court, though, a majority of whom were Southerners, ruled that first, blacks were not citizens, and thus they could not file a suit. Slaves, in the eyes of the court, were to be considered property that could be taken anywhere. And finally, the court argued that slavery could not be banned if it deprived the migrating slave owner of his property, that being slaves. The court also declared that portions of the Missouri Compromise were unconstitutional, and this continued the downward spiral the United States went into toward civil war. The Lincoln-Douglas debates took place in 1858 in Illinois. These were a series of debates between Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen Douglas, both of whom were running for Douglas's senator seat. Lincoln was the Republican nominee and Douglas the Democratic nominee. Slavery was the main issue in the debates, and a significant amount of national attention followed the debates. The speeches of both men frequently appeared in major American newspapers. Though Lincoln narrowly lost the Senate election, his rhetorical brilliance in the debates raised his national stature in the years before the pivotal presidential election of 1860. John Brown was a radical abolitionist who argued that armed insurrection was the best way and the preferred way to abolish slavery in the United States. He considered himself to be something of an agent of God, chosen by God to end slavery or to lead the fight against slavery. In the era known as Bleeding Kansas, due to conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, Brown and his sons hacked to death 5 pro-slavery settlers with broadswords. Brown led a failed 1859 attack on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. He believed this would be the catalyst for the start of an armed slave rebellion, and he planned to use the armory's weapons to give to the slaves. Unfortunately for Brown, the hoped-for rebellion did not materialize. The botched raid was defeated by U.S. Marines led by, of all people, Colonel Robert E. Lee, prior to his becoming military leader of the South. However, news of Brown's exploits frightened many white Southerners, and the action was viewed by many in the South that Northerners were planning to destroy the South by any and all means. The election of 1860, the key issue here was the issue of slavery, which caused deep rifts in the various political factions. Slavery had divided the parties. Lincoln pledged to end the expansion of slavery, but not to interfere with the South. He received vote totals as high as 75% in some northern and far western counties, while he did not even bother to get on the ballot in many southern states. He received slightly less than 40% of the total presidential vote. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's former opponent in the senatorial race in 1858, received the support of northern Democrats, but fared very poorly in the South. You can see on the map he only carried the state of Missouri. Overall, though, Douglas received about 29% of the total vote, coming in second place in total vote, but a very distant fourth place in terms of electoral votes. John Breckinridge won the votes of a vast majority of Southern Democrats, but again, in this era of fractured parties, he did not poll well in the North. He happened to be the sitting vice president under then-President James Buchanan, and after the South voted to secede, Breckinridge came to be a Confederate general. He received about 18% of the total vote in 1860. Finally, John Bell ran under the Constitutional Union Party, which was mostly pro-slavery, but it was one that put the strength of the Union above sectional issues such as slavery. He received about 13% of the vote, carried the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee in that border region. Finally, in the period from 1800 to 1860, the North, which did not have slavery, industrialized, urbanized, and engaged in a wide variety of commercial agriculture. Simultaneously, the South concentrated on plantation agriculture, and it was heavily dependent on export cotton using slave labor, along with subsistence farming by poor white farmers. While the economies of the North and South were in many ways complementary, for example, Southern cotton was a critical element in the northern textile industry, the economic differences helped promote cultural and social differences between North and South, and in one sense, the northern and southern states were already behaving like different nations at the time of the Civil War, and the events that unfolded at Fort Sumter merely made official what had already been widely recognized by most people.